So I felt like after the session yesterday, I just ran out of time, and I wanted to finish on time, and I just was also a little bit tired. I didn't really bring the whole thing to a conclusion, among other many things I could have done better, I suppose. But I was impressed at all the men who came and the interest they showed and the evident conviction to try to be better in their lives. To summarize a little bit of what we talked about yesterday, because I think it relates to what we'll talk about today, is we tried to begin at the beginning, where man was placed into the world and had a specific role different from that of woman, even before the fall. Once the fall came, of course, evil came into the world and it propagated, and it created all kinds of new temptations. And some of those things which God had placed within men, the male part of the creation in God's image, now become opportunities for abuse, or can be temptations in various ways. So if I was given the ambition to dominate or subdue the creation, which God gave Adam even before the fall, that might now be directed toward people, maybe even my wife or my children, so that they might be embittered, to use the language of Colossians, or they might be exasperated, to use the old-timey language about children. And if I direct that sense of a need to accomplish and to rule and subdue and have dominion in the wrong direction, then I'm sinning. And I'm falling victim to what Satan has put into the world as a result of the fall. But there is this challenge, though, to let you know, men have a desire to succeed. We have a desire to make a plan and make it happen that I think is a little bit more than women have. And we want to be in control, and we have a little bit of an ego sometimes. And we want to be recognized and all of that. So the question is, if those are put within us by God, maybe even before the fall, sure enough, they represent temptations, but is there some proper use to which they should be put? That need to accomplish and conquer, right? To set a goal and plan and make it happen and feel like we've been victorious in doing that. We love to play football, right? That's just a small example. But how are we to direct that character in our struggle in this fallen world? And we tried to wrestle with that. I think the songs this morning have been just almost like a story of the solution to that, right? First of all, we're in a battle for sure. We're in a battle with evil. That's the war we're in. The battle belongs to the Lord. We need to trust in Him. And the way we equip ourselves, the second song, was we put on the armor of God. We made a reference to that in the last song as well. That's His armor. I reminded the men several times that book of Ephesians, which has the first 3 chapters are, here's the teaching, and the last 3 chapters is, so then therefore live this way, right? Has all that discussion about family relationships. A whole rich chapter about wives and husbands of wives. They're in the latter part of chapter 5. It goes on to children and fathers. But you know what the last part of chapter 6 is about? It's that armor of God chapter that we just sung about. So there's somehow this merging of being a family leader and being a warrior. How do you reconcile those two things, right? And of course, the third song we sang kind of told that story. Make me a servant just like your son. And there's some sense of service in our accomplishment, in our opposition to evil. But our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly places. It's a spiritual battle. But if we can direct that sense of a need to conquer and to accomplish and to fight against evil, and even revenge, I have to say, but direct it toward evil, against Satan, that's what God wants us to do. And faith is the victory. Right? And maybe that battle will be over and will be won by those of us who struggle. So this morning, I want to talk about a time in Israel's history when there was a battle, and there were forces of good and evil, and there was a poor guy who didn't have much going for him, and he was called on to be a leader. And that's the way I feel most of the time. But I want to talk about then what the secret of effective leadership is. This is a little bit like the capstone of all of what we've been studying, the secret of effective leadership. And when we talked forever yesterday, I keep thinking of that text in James, I guess it is, where the multitude of words there does not want transgression. Is that where that is? I don't know. But if you talk a lot, you're going to say something wrong. Okay, I'm going to try to summarize what is the secret to effective leadership. And I think to answer that question, you maybe want to ask the question, what is a leader? That would be helpful. And one easy way to get a sermon up is to get a concordance out and look up the word that you're going to talk about, right? Leader. So I look up leader. Some of us yesterday, some people in the background were helping me sort through some other things by doing searches on Bible texts and so on. If you do a search on leader in the Bible, you find it's in there maybe 120 different times, mostly in the Old Testament. I think only 4 or 5 times in the New Testament, depending on the version. Now I'm talking about the English word that's translated leader. In the Old Testament, in almost every case, it just refers to a position of authority. It's not really saying this person was a leader because, but it's a positional authority thing. You know what I mean by that? You have a title, you're the head of the tribe or something like that. But in the New Testament, of those 4 or 5 times, there's not a one of them that's any good. I'll give you an example. You are blind, leaders of the blind. I don't want to learn from that one, right? And the other times it's used is kind of like the Jewish leaders who are out to crucify the Lord. So that's probably not the best place to look for what a leader should be. Okay, well, I could look to secular literature, and in secular literature there's lots of definitions of leader, but you know the problem with that, and that is that most of the literature, research, writing, popular articles, TV shows about leadership, where do they come from? They come from the corporate world. The church is very different from the corporate world, and so are families and so on. So that's a little bit dangerous to use that as well. But there have been some men like John Maxwell and others who've tried to merge the teaching of the Bible with teaching on leadership. Some of the simple definitions of what a leader is in that world are someone who gets people to do something they don't want to do but ought to. That's one. Another one is very simple. It just says a leader is anyone who has followers. Remember that one. Even a simpler one is a leader is anyone who has influence. Right? It might not even be that people follow, but you've made a change in some way. So that could be. So keep that in mind. But you know the right place to go to find out what a leader is to look to Jesus, who really is our example in just about every role that we have. We just sang a song about make me a servant, just like your son. So where would you go to look at that? There is a Psalm, 110 I think it is. I understand that that psalm is quoted more often than any other psalm in the New Testament. And it's a messianic psalm, no doubt about it. And it does talk about Jesus, for sure. You remember this was used by Jesus to I guess what would the word be? Give a question that they couldn't answer. There's the reference to Melchizedek later in there. So a lot of references in Psalm 110. And here's what it says. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. That's definitely a leader. And you know it's talking about the Messiah. David making the reference. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. We talked about yesterday, that word for rule is really used in reference to elders and other things. Now, the word leader isn't there, but you can see there's a leader there, isn't it? Ruling in the midst of the enemies. And it's warlike in a way. There's reference to enemies, and that kind of fits our theme a little bit, that is we're in a warfare in a fallen world against the forces of Satan. In fact, if you go on and read in the Psalm, you'll find it goes on to have some kind of violent language, right, about dead bodies and, executing people and things like that. The leaders of the enemies will be executed. But wait, that is saying rule in the midst of your enemies. But I would like to read the next verse, which says, your people, you see a contrast there? He's ruling in the midst of his enemies, but your people, who are they? This is Jesus, Messianic. Your people what? Will offer themselves freely or willingly on the day of your power in holy garments. That's a little bit different, isn't it? Than having to rule or execute fisted authority over your enemies, even maybe in terms of violence and things like that. And that phrase, your people offer themselves willingly, do you see in that language a kind of sacrificial reference? They offer. They're coming forward, and what they're doing is giving up something. Maybe their whole lives, their bodies are being offered as a sacrifice. There's that image as well in that phrase. That phrase is not too frequently found in the Old Testament, but it is found a few places. I think that's instructive. The first one I would make a reference to is here in Nehemiah 11. Apparently in the rebuilding of the city, it was needed that workers be to live in the city, but the people who came back, they wanted to kind of go out and establish their homes in the outer territories. Nehemiah lived in the city, and the leaders did, there's our word by the way, lived in the city, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in the other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. That's one interesting place it's found. Now, I don't know for sure whether it was kind of a better to win the lottery or lose the lottery in this case, right? It looks as if it was maybe an inconvenience to have to go live in Jerusalem and be a worker, in which case you were offering something. You were making a sacrifice, but you were doing it willingly. Do you see the difference in that kind of leadership? And they just said, okay, yeah, we'll do that. And the people blessed them for what they did, making that sacrifice. That's one place where that's found. The only other place I found this phrase is found in Judges chapter 5, verse 2. What's cool about that is the leader word is there, at least in some translations, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it says, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. And strangely enough, if you go down about 7 more verses to verse 9, it says, the rulers or the leaders offered themselves willingly. Now, do you know that story? Judges 5 is the song of Deborah and Barak, it says, after the successful victory over Jabin, who was ruling in Hazor, a Canaanite who had conquered the people for about 20 years. And he had a captain of his army, Sisera. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. And so they win the victory, and Deborah and Barak celebrate with this song. And it says, when leaders lead in Israel. One implication, if you just read the English, is that they weren't leading. And all of a sudden now they began, and that was important for them to begin. You might just be turning over to Judges chapters 4 and 5, because that's where we're going to take most of the text from, the lessons from this morning. This phrase, leaders lead in Israel, is not really very easy to translate. That's probably a good guess at maybe the intent of what the phrase is, but some of the literal translations, and they're all over the place, are when locks are loosed, like locks of hair or something. The word in the Septuagint is something like the word I think used for the name of the book of Revelation, where it says when the revealing is revealed or something. It's like a double word somehow. Or the beginning begins or something like that. The revealing is revealed, something like that. It appears to be this emergence of something. And perhaps the reference to locks flowing, I don't quite understand, that might be the Hebrew word, could be related to the Nazirite vow. You remember Samson with the long hair? What happens when this hair is long is there's strength that's being exposed. Maybe that's it. I don't really know. Very difficult to translate that. It's not hard to translate the people offered themselves willingly, and so that's what I'd like to talk about this morning. So, do you know what? I've already finished the first lesson. Do you know what the secret of effective leadership is? Is the people offer themselves willingly. So I have a new title now. I'm not going to talk about the secret of effective leadership. I'm going to talk about what it means when the people offer themselves willingly. And we're going to learn about that from this story. So here were the conditions in Israel about that time. It was about 100 years after Joshua had conquered the land. And in case I forget to say it, Jabin, who was their enemy in this case, was a Canaanite. He wasn't a Syrian, he wasn't Babylonian. He was right there in the center of the land. Just as God had promised, he said, because you haven't purged the people, I'm going to leave them. And there will be a test to you to see whether you will obey me or not. And so I almost see this whole incident, and all of them really, as a test of Israel. Do you really believe this or not? What's interesting is Joshua had actually, Jabin ruled out of Hazor, which is was a capital city for that area, according to Joshua 11. By the way, I will mix up Joshua and Judges. Just keep your head on and see if you try to figure out which. But I am really referring to Joshua now, chapter 11. Hazor was a capital 100 years earlier, and Joshua had burned it to the ground, despite the fact that there were chariots in the area, and he had hamstrung the horses in that northern area of Canaan. You may not remember all that story, but there had been a conquest of this, despite chariots and everything that happened 100 years before. And now the period of the judges had passed, and Shamgar, who's referenced later in the poem here at the very beginning of the poem, and Ehud and Shamgar. Ehud, remember the left-handed guy, and Shamgar, which were kind of a little bit like Lone Rangers, although they did get support after they would kind of take the leadership. They had passed, and the people had fallen under the rule that God had brought about because they departed from him, of Jabin, who ruled out of Hazor. And so there's a spiritual apostasy. Did evil in the sight of the Lord, chapter 4, verse 1. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, chapter 4, verse 2. And then over in chapter 5, verse 8, they chose new gods, that's what he says, and that's the reason for that. Right. So militarily, they were in kind of a tough spot. There had been a 20-year domination. It mentions over and over in this text, it's almost humorous how often it's mentioned that there were chariots involved. Do you know why that's significant? They were not just chariots, they were iron chariots. If you know anything about the history, there was this transition going on from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. It's a harder metal. The Israelites were always behind in technology. So they didn't have that, but the Canaanites did. In fact, you learn from a similar period, actually a little bit later, the Israelites couldn't even sharpen their own farm implements. They had to go down to Philistia to get their farm implements sharpened. And you can kind of see earlier back in the book of Judges, if I can find it, yes, chapter 1, verse 19. The Lord was with Judah. They drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland. Why? Because they had chariots of iron. So there was a tactical advantage. You know how chariots work? I think there's a guy in the front driving. They got maybe a horse or maybe more than one, and they're roaring down the road. And by the way, Israelites were not too good at horses either. In this phase of their history, they were on donkeys, apparently, according to some of the later judges, right? And David progressed to riding a mule, as it turns out. But it wasn't until Solomon came that they got the horse thing going, probably against God's will. But still, horses, chariots, horses rolling down the battlefield, the man in the front driving, the guy in the back shooting, throwing arrows, everything. If you didn't get run over by the chariot, you were going to be shot or stabbed or something by the guy in the back when he rolled over you. And by the way, unarmed. Look over there in chapter 5, verse 8. They chose new gods. There was war in the gates. Not a shield nor spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. So, yeah, I mean, if you had one, it wouldn't be much help against this tank, essentially a tank, right? That is these chariots. But they didn't even have that. They were going to be rolled over as unarmed men. That's the situation they were in militarily. So, not a good story. I think I have a map here. I'd like to point out a few of the locations just so you get them in your head. So here's Hazor, way up to the north of the Sea of Galilee, as it was called later. But it's up here. Kedesh is where Barak lived. Deborah was down here in near Bethel, I think. Now, this valley right here, there's a mountain range that runs right along here. It's the Carmel Range. And it ends up here. I think modern Haifa is up here, a nice coastal city. But this is the river Kishon that comes along there. And there's a plain that's all out through here. It's very fertile. It's also a place where the armies would come through, and they would, or the traders would even come through, a main highway through here. This plain right here, hopeless if you're up against chariots. You see that? I mean, it's just a flat, it's where they live. And we don't know for sure where Harosheth Hagoyim, or Harosheth of the Gentiles or the nations, is. I don't really know. That's where Sisera kept his army. I think of it as like a bat cave, right? When it was time to come out, boom, they came out. One thought is it's somewhere on one side or the other of this river, and there's one valley that maybe is thought to be the site where it's maybe about a half a mile wide that goes up into the range, and he lived up in there with his chariots, and when it was time to go to war, boom, they'd come out like they were coming out of the bat cave, to go and bring their chariots where they needed to go in the plain, in the flat area. So that wasn't the best situation for that, but that's kind of the picture. And so what you'll see is after the battle, the river Kishon plays into that, the army tries to go back this way with their chariots, but Sisera tries to escape this way, and he comes up there, and there's a little town up there near Hazor where Jael, who was a Kenite, lived, and you know the rest of the story there with the tent peg and all that. I think you know these stories, but just make sure we've got the details down. So Tabor, I'll have to animate it again. Tabor is about right there. So it's on the northern or eastern edge of that valley that runs through here, but it's kind of right there. And if the chariots could come out and come down, and the battle would be in that area around that area right there. Commercial life was suppressed. Look at chapter 5, verse 6. In those days, the highways were deserted. The travelers walked by the byways. You couldn't even get out on the main road. You had to hide and travel through the hills. Village life ceased. There's war in the gates is also mentioned in that text. I don't know what that means exactly. Maybe the hostilities had come into every town of any significant size, but it may also mean that there was just anarchy. And the gates are where you'd go for justice or for civil order, but they were just in turmoil. Everything was messed up. Civil turmoil, no commerce, military domination. They were having to hide. It reminds us of another character And that would be in the time of Gideon and the Midianites. In fact, in some ways, Gideon and Barak are tied together. One of the reasons I want to pick this story is because Barak is one of those guys that he's just ordinary, and he's not very courageous. He has to be pushed into what he needs to do. If you remember in the book of Hebrews, Barak is mentioned as one of the heroes of faith. You remember that list? In fact, he says time will fail to tell of. And then he mentions Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah. It's interesting, that's out of order. Gideon and Barak, that's the reverse order. It's Barak and Gideon if you read the story in the book of Judges. And it's Jephthah and Samson. It's not Samson. Why would the Hebrew writer get that mixed up? I think he may be pairing those two. Do you see a similarity between Jephthah and Samson, those of you that know the story? They were not frightful. Maybe they were rash in many ways. They probably needed to control some of their risk-taking and vow-making and other things like that. But I'll tell you, Gideon and Barak go together. Why? They were somewhat doubtful. They needed to be pushed into things that needed to be done. So I think those go together. Remember, Gideon had to have the fleece thing and the vision thing at night. So Gideon, whom the angel called the mighty man of valor, Gideon didn't get that. He didn't think that was true. Barak, in a similar way, had to be pushed into action for what he wanted to do. All right. So there was little national unity. There were no leaders in Israel, as we talked about. All right. How does the battle proceed? Let's look over in chapter 4 and start about verse 4. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time, and she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali. You know that's a long way away. I was trying to show you on the map. Ephraim's down well below the Sea of Galilee. That's way above that. So she calls for him to come. Notice what she says in verse 6. Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded you, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor, take with you 10,000 men of the son of Naphtali and Zebulun. Now, the reason for that is those are tribes way up there, but that's where Hazor was. That was their problem. Hazor was in their Naphtali's area, and Barak, according to this, maybe it's just the way it's worded, she says, has not God commanded you? Does that make you think that Barak probably should have figured out for himself that he should have been taking leadership here? And she had to say, look, this is in your area, not mine, but it's in your area. Hasn't God called you to take care of this? And I'm remembering that language earlier, that God left those nations as a test to see if they would believe in him or not. And she calls him out and says, you should do that. And this is God speaking now. And against you, Deborah speaking God's words, what I mean to say. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots, there they are again, and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. Great. Perfect. I was just waiting for somebody to make that suggestion, Barak says. No, not really. And Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I'll go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. I don't see a great deal of confidence in this guy. Now, he knew Deborah had some special connection with God, and maybe it was a little like dragging the Ark of the Covenant into the battle. I don't know, but maybe he thought she would be good luck. Or, look, if you're so confident that this is going to work out right, then you're going to be with me, right? And we'll see. And see if you're as confident as you say you are when you're telling me to go, right? Do you see a great confidence in Barak's leadership? Do you see initiative? Do you see courage? Do you see an inspiring character with the great wisdom to know exactly what to do and dragging everybody else along who might be doubtful? No, I don't see that. I don't see that in Barak. So he is called to his duty, chapter 4. And so he does call for the men to come, 10,000 of them. They come first to Kedesh, his hometown, and then they go to Mount Tabor. This is what Mount Tabor looks like, this is what it looks like today. I'm sure the terrain is somewhat similar. It's a conical mountain. It's not that big. My point is, in showing this picture is, I don't think you can hide 10,000 men on this mountain. Right? Especially if they all come at once. Where are they going to go? Maybe they tried to sneak around to the backside, but it didn't work. And the idea was they're going to go up in this mountain. Why would they go up in the mountain? I know why I would go up in the mountain with chariots as a potential danger. I'd stay up there, in fact. But I would be in the mountain. 10,000, but probably not a secret. And it turns out, if you keep reading, in verse 10, Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh. He went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. By the way, I don't think it was a good thing that he asked her to go with him, only because she said, you know, you won't get the glory as a result of that. That's the conclusion I draw, that if he'd been more of a leader, he wouldn't have had to have that. But that's just a side point, I think. But anyway, a side note in verse 11 about Heber the Kenite, which is going to come back later with the story of Jael. Anyway, verse 12, and they reported to Sisera that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor. Uh-oh. Bat cave opens up. Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron. Did I mention the chariots before? Just a side note. When you get to the end of the song in chapter 5, Sisera's mom, another mother, but not in Israel, right? Her mom was waiting for Sisera to come home. And you know how she knew he was driving up? I'm listening for the horse's hoofs, because that's his trademark sound. That was what Sisera was known for. But anyway, Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him from Harosheth-Hagoyim to where? The river Kishon, the river valley. Okay, you've got the scene. We're up around the campfires, up around on Mount Tabor, feeling pretty safe, right? And I'm guessing that Barak and Deborah are standing on the edge of some prominent rock somewhere, and they're looking out there at all those chariots out in that flat plain and all those armed men. And I don't know if you can hear the sounds that horses make and the rattling of that metal that we don't have very much of. And, you know, and I'm guessing that the men are all kind of looking up over at their leader and saying, okay, what do we do? And here again, verse 14 then of chapter 4, then Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. I love the past tense there. It's just so certain. She just says, it's happened already. Has not the Lord gone out before you? Now, when she says up, I guess it really meant down, but in any case, but the idea was get going, right? And I don't know if she said up, or she said up. You know, let's go, go. I don't know which it was. Maybe she was watching the weather. We'll see that the weather plays a role in this. But somehow or another, she had to kick him into duty there and say, this is the time. Maybe that was the Lord's will, to time it perfectly so that when they came down the hill, the Lord would fight for them the way he did fight for them. But she pushed him into it. She had to initiate that action that he took. Okay. And so Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. I'm just thinking, does this mean a little bit more when it says the people offered themselves willingly? How would you feel in that battle, charging down the mountain now against all those chariots without much of a weapon in your hand? They offered themselves. It was a sacrifice, perhaps. And the Lord routed Sisera, verse 15, and all his chariots and all his armies with the edge of the sword before Barak, and Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. How in the world did they accomplish that? How could they beat those chariots? Not in the mountains, but in the plains. How could they do that? It's interesting that the narrative is fairly plain and forthright about it, right? But you have to look over to the poem to kind of see what was happening. Look in verse 4 of chapter 5. And I know you had a meeting with Gary Fisher, and he covered right, Brother Legg told me this. It's been a year, though, or so, I think, so maybe this is fresh. But you can go back and listen to that one, too. But in any case, what happened, actually, is the Lord went out from Seir. You marched from the field of Eden. That's over places to the east. The idea is something came in. A storm blew in from the east. The earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds also poured water. The mountains gushed before the Lord, this Sinai before the Lord of Israel. Why would he make a reference to Sinai? Haggai does that. He says, once more shall I shake the earth. That was a key event in Israel's history where the presence of God shook the mountain. And there was smoke and there was noise, so much the Israelites said, that's enough, you go get the law. We're going to wait down here. And that kind of might was demonstrated. How did that happen? What was that? Well, it's pretty clear what happened was there was a big torrential rainstorm with thunder and lightning, and the river overflowed its banks, and it muddied up all the plain, and the horses couldn't pull the chariots. And not only that, the thunder scared all the horses to death, and they were out of control. They were frightened to death. And who was fighting this battle in that case, where the heavens and the earth were shaking and all? It was God, just like at Sinai is what he's saying. And as a result, they had to flee. That just seems crazy. And why in the world would Sisera jump out of his chariot to run away? If I had a chariot with horses, I'd get going and put it in overdrive. But he couldn't move. He had to jump out, perhaps, and escape on foot. And by the way, the river Kishon is not this torrential river. Maybe it was at the time, but I doubt it. It only took this enormous amount of rain to turn it into this flood that was produced there. So that's what happened. They were defeated. And I say Jabin because that's the way it's described in verse 23, but it's really Sisera's army. He was the captain of Jabin's army. Okay, Sisera escaped, and then you remember the rest of the story. He headed up north where Heber lived, which was close to Hazor, and apparently there was some sort of a truce between the Canaanites and the Kenites, who were not quite Israelites. They were descendants of Jethro, if that means anything to you. But he goes into the tent, and you know the story that Jael got him to sleep, gave him some milk, covered him up, said, I'll watch at the door. He says, if anybody comes, tell them there's nobody in here. Don't worry, go right to sleep. She got the tent peg and nailed it through his head into the ground. And he was killed. And so the woman got the glory for the actual killing of the leader of these armies. Okay. How do people offer themselves willingly? Deborah said it happened here. And remember, that's the secret of effective leadership. It probably was not Barak, was it? It was the people's offering themselves willingly. And of course, Jehovah who won the battle. I'd like to look at some ways that they offer themselves willingly. The first is they have to show up. Look over in chapter 5 and I'm going to do this a little backwards, chapter 5, verse 15, the very end of the book. The verse. Among the divisions of Reuben there were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the pipings for the flocks? The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. Why did Dan remain on the ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets. One thing you can notice is that these tribes that were referenced here, Reuben and others, they were not quite in the middle of the problem, right? Naphtali was, right? Zebulun was, but not these other tribes. They were over by the seashore. They had things to do. Now, in the case of Reuben, they were with them, right? I'm with you. I'm supporting you, but I have stuff to do. I can't quite be there, but I'm with you. And I'll just start to talk in maybe more practical terms this morning. This church, these people here, in some ways are arrayed against the forces of Satan in Gettysburg and in this area. You have some daunting tasks, I think, I feel this way, to take the gospel to this area. Does that seem possible to you? Does it feel a little bit like launching yourself into the valley against chariots of iron? To have some influence like that in this community? And so there are some leaders here. They may be as imperfect as Barak. I don't know, but they made a plan of some kind to maybe have a meeting or have an evangelistic effort or have an extra class or have some kind of resources available that you could point people to teach the gospel. And I am for them. They do great things down at the church. They have good people in for the meetings. But I'm a little busy. I have some things to take care of. I have some ships that need maintenance, right? You can't just leave ships. A man's got to make a living, you know what I mean? We just can't drop everything we're doing and go do some kind of thing like fighting against these Canaanites. So yeah, they had resolves of heart. And they were not opposed to this battle, of course. They were happy to see that this was going on. And I think they were rooting for those Israelites, right? Despite their disadvantage. But I'm not there. I'm not there. I'm not showing up. And I ask you about this. You're surely for everything that happens here in this congregation under the leaders, the imperfect leaders that you have. And the efforts which seem a little bit, I don't think that'll work. But are you supporting it? Are you showing up? So that's one thing, you got to show up. There's another thing, being too busy. Interesting look at Meroz. over in verse 23. I don't know for sure what this means, but it's a city, we think. We don't even know where Meroz is. There may be a reason for that. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants bitterly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord against the mighty. As if the Lord needed help, but Meroz didn't come. Here's the best explanation for that. Meroz was a city up in Naphtali, somewhere close to Hazor. And you know what? One idea is that they had made an alliance with the king of Hazor. And even though they were Israelites, they had a treaty, and what would happen if they showed up in the battle and fought against him? Can you imagine that? That's a theory, but there's some evidence for that. And cursed be Meroz. And where is it today? We don't even know. We don't even know. Is there some times in our lives that we have made a covenant with evil, and there's some immorality or some hidden thing that makes us feel so hypocritical when we show up to be doing spiritual things or to defend the truth of the gospel that we just can't do it? We've made a covenant. And if we do that, we're just going to feel terrible. And it'll kind of tear up our lives in some way. It's just seemed the case to me. I always think of 2 Peter chapter 2. Lot vexed his soul from day to day when he lived there in Sodom. Who vexed his soul? The Sodomites? No, it was Lot. Was it God? No. He was so conflicted, knowing he shouldn't be there, I suppose, and seeing the damage it was doing. And I think Meroz is there and they're saying, but, well, we can't actually go against this guy. I know we're supposed to, but we've kind of made some arrangements and I don't know what to do. And so I just can't come. Angel says, you're cursed. Why? They were Canaanites? No, Israelites. The language suggests they're traitors, is what it suggests. I'll tell you, sometimes if we're not showing up because there's hypocrisy or we're playing two different roles in our life, that's a great danger, and God calls judgment on that city. So show up. Second thing I would suggest is we need to bring what we have. Now, some of this makes sense. Look up in verse 14 of chapter 15. What you see there is Ephraim, from Ephraim, by the way, that's that middle section. They actually, the battle was taking place kind of in their territory. From Ephraim were those whose roots were in Amalek. Don't fully understand that, but I think it means they were experienced in battle. Remember the Amalekites? Continual problem to get these Amalekites destroyed. But apparently they had some experience in battle. But for sure, and you, Benjamin, with your peoples, you know all the story about the Benjamites, right? Starting with Ehud, and I think the reference that I've put up there is David had these Benjamites from Saul's family, or Saul's tribe, ironically, who had gathered with him. They could sling a sling and shoot an arrow with both hands. That's amazing. I know one of the lessons was something about left-handed warriors. I'm telling you, Benjamites were frightening people. They were warriors. And I want them to be there, right? I need them in the battle. And I understand why Amalek would come with their experience against the Amaleks, and I understand why the Benjamites would be there with their experience, both hand experience in all kinds of warfare. You see evidence of that all the way through. Saul was a Benjamite, probably a big guy. But this is interesting. Machir, keep reading, the rulers came down. From Zebulun, those who bear the recruiter's staff. I'm reading the New King James. You probably have something different. And the reason is, literally, it hardly makes any sense at all what those words mean. The lawgivers is what it means. Machir, that's probably part of Manasseh, half-tribe Manasseh. Probably the Transjordan. No, probably not. But anyway, it's Manasseh. Machir, the lawgivers came down. What that probably means is administrators of some kind, right? The people who kind of kept track, or maybe they were judges in some way, lawgivers, teachers maybe. And then, even stranger, Zebulun sent those who bear the recruiter's staff. That literally, that Hebrew word means the instrument or the tool of writing. They were writers. They were scribes. They were English majors. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. You see what I'm getting at here? And I'm thinking that there's these Benjamites, over around the campfire, and these experienced warriors, that had fought against the Amalekites. And what are they doing here? What are they going to do? Who invited those guys? Can you imagine that? What are they going to do? Well, maybe they could carry messages. I don't know. Maybe they kept track of the battle. Maybe they they recruited people. That's one idea. You can see that in the way this word is translated. I don't know, but they were useful. And they came to the battle, and they were praised by Deborah for bringing what they had. And you might think at first that whatever you can do, if it's drawing pictures with a writing tool, if that's what it is, or you can organize something, or you can give people rides, or you can make food and take it to people, or you can teach other people some little skill that you know how to do, bring it. Bring it. That's what the message is. And Deborah says they came with their writing instruments and their lawgiver administrators. That's what happened. So bring what you have. But more significant is Issachar. If you read on down, they were under Barak's feet. The princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As Issachar, so was Barak sent into the valley under his command. Literally, it's under his feet. I don't know what you think of Barak as a leader, but can you imagine saying, I'm at your feet? Right. It's your idea to charge into the valley where the chariots are and we don't have any weapons. I'm behind you. I'm at your feet and I'm with you. Let me just say this. I can probably stop here, maybe make this application. It doesn't matter where I do. I think this is as good a point as any. We studied some things this weekend. I don't know if it changed any lives or not. One of the things we did is we took a little self-assessments. Some of you wives may have been asked to share in that by your husbands. And we assessed various things. And part of it was to say, what is missing in my family? What are some actions I can take to maybe shore up those weaknesses? We are not good men. We have all of these flaws that we're trying to overcome, and we don't make the best plans, and our egos are fragile, okay? And so if your husband or your dad or someone who is an influence in your life says, you know what, I'd like to try to do something different, and it seemed like a kind of a knuckle-headed idea, why don't we just serve at their feet and let's just do this? Because you know what the secret to effective leadership is? People offering themselves willingly. And we're all imperfect. We don't know what to do, but we feel this obligation to try to do something to be better, to make our families more spiritual, to build those protections against Satan. And Issachar was at the feet of Deborah and Barak. And so I'm appealing to you, though, that weren't here yesterday, or maybe those that are and are in some way subject to those who are. If there's a plan that's being made, let's go with it. Let's try to make it work. And that's the secret of effective leadership. But that doesn't mean I'm finished with the lesson. So they risked their lives. It makes sense because it was their territory where Hazor lived. And then Jael. You know the story of Jael. I won't dwell on it. It's a little bit bloody. It's a little bit violent. And yet, Deborah says of Jael, blessed are thou among women. Have you ever heard that phrase before? It's only used of one other woman in the whole Bible. It's actually used twice of Mary. It's found in Luke, chapter 1, I think. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is called blessed among women. I'll tell you what the deal was with the tent people, right? Apparently, the women were charged with kind of maintaining the tent, kind of the household, so to speak. These people lived in tents. That's a longer story, but tent pegs come out of the ground. First of all, they have to be driven in the ground. They come out of the ground. You got to put them up. Maybe a high windstorm. Maybe it's time to move, whatever. I don't know. Jael was not that good at a sword or a spear or a chariot, but she was good at driving tent pegs, I'll bet. That's what she probably did her whole life. And she may have gotten tired of just doing this day after day, putting them back in the ground and saying, there's got to be more to life than this, you know. And it came time, and she knew where the hammer was, and she knew where the peg was, and she knew how to use it. And so she did. An opportune time. And so she used what she had. Now I want to talk about the third element. I'm so proud of having a 3-point sermon. Despite the fact the introduction was way too long. But anyway, it's 3 points, right? I'm sorry, I should read this text because it's saying just what I said. As any has received the gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, speak as oracles of God. Whoever serves, the one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified. Isn't that what we're saying? Use the capabilities that we have. Okay, point number 3 is not just show up, not just use what you have, be a leader maker. Turn people into leaders. And I think this is especially true because this is a story about Deborah, isn't it? What do we know about Deborah? Well, she was a wife. I assume she followed God's laws with regard to her submission to her husband. I assume that's the case. You know, somehow Deborah makes us feel uncomfortable because was she a judge or not? I don't know. Maybe that's an exception that breaks all the other rules and clear teaching we have in the Bible. I don't know. We don't know how to deal with it. Let's look at Deborah. She was a wife. She was a prophetess. She spoke for God. We saw that in the text. She was quoting something God said. She was a judge. Apparently men came to her and had hard questions, and she would tell them truth and help them understand what God's will was. That's what she did. But how does she describe herself? Do you know in that poem? Until I, Deborah, what? A mother in Israel. Now, does that mean she just had children, or was she a mother in a larger sense? In what mothers do? To train people, to push people, to correct people, to chide people, right? To make them better spiritually, to make them into the leaders they should be. Was it Deborah's intent to lead the armies into battle? No. I don't even think she did. Was it her intent even to go to the battle? No, I don't think so. Barak was supposed to go by himself, and she said, well, okay, I'll go with you. If that's what you want, that's what I'll do. If you need that. She was a mother in Israel. Has not the Lord of God commanded you? She said to Barak, right? I'll just tell you a little bit. I remember when I was being evaluated, I think maybe that's the right word, to be an elder. The people who came to me with the best admonition and warnings and, Marty, you're good at this, but you have to work on this thing over here. Guess who they were? It was the people-oriented people. We talked about that some yesterday. It's the people who knew how I came across, even though my words were correct, but the feelings, the impression I was making were not that good. And I needed that guidance. And I came across in ways I never understood. It was the mothers at Ember Hills who came to me and said, I don't mean my mothers, and they weren't necessarily all mothers literally, but they were mothers in the ways that I needed them to be mothers, to say, you should be doing this, or you should change in this way. That's one way to be a leader maker, is to be a mother to folks. There are other leader makers in the Bible. I was going to show some of these. Barnabas. Saul, who had been killing Christians, came to the church in Jerusalem and said, I'd like to be a member here. And they said, I don't think so. And so Barnabas took him and brought him back and said, no, you don't understand about this man. He is useful. He's preaching in the name of Jesus. And he convinced the apostles that, yes, Saul is an okay guy, and he would be useful in the church here. Can we vouch for somebody and help them find an assignment that's needed? And he went to Tarsus to seek Saul to be a teacher in Antioch. Think of other examples besides Barnabas and Saul. Saul or Paul recruited Timothy to go with him. And I could go into a lot of detail about how Paul pushed Timothy, sent him back to Thessalonica alone, a great challenge, a church that had only been there a few weeks maybe, to send him back and confirm that church there, right? He left him at Ephesus to correct those men, told him, don't be afraid, don't be ashamed of me, the prisoner of the Lord. And he vouched for him, 1 Corinthians 16. He says, let's see that he be with you without fear. In Philippians, there's no man like Timothy. He encouraged him. But you could list others. John Mark comes to mind, probably Titus, no doubt Aquila and Priscilla, probably Apollos at some level. All these people that Saul or Paul was actually helping to mentor. And Jesus himself. And I almost skipped over Lois and Eunice, of course, who were mothers, literally mothers and grandmothers to Timothy. I think the main thing, though, Deborah said was, he said, will you go with me? And she says, I will surely go with you. That's the secret of effective leadership, is when someone says, I will surely go with you. And that's what Deborah did for Barak. So I'm appealing to you, whatever these men who came yesterday, whatever they remember, I don't know. I talked way too much. But I hope in their self-assessment that we maybe have all of us made some resolutions to change what we do, to enter into the battle, so to speak. And some of it may seem like this isn't going to work, or this is kind of a meager attempt, and we're not equipped, and we'll never accomplish anything this way. You know what the secret of effective leadership is now. The secret of effective leadership is the people offer themselves willingly. They're supposed to be, yeah. And how does that happen? By showing up, by using the skills you have, and by being leader makers. I think that picture right there about offering themselves willingly is bigger than just a local church or a family, though, isn't it? This is a picture of how Christians respond. And whatever visible kingdom you see, and however powerful or not that it looks, And whether our weapons, which are not carnal, look very adequate to the great battle that we have to face, the battle belongs to the Lord. And the challenge we have is not just will we submit to our imperfect husbands or our elders or the teachers in our classes or our dads and moms. That's not the challenge, really. It's a small shadow of the bigger challenges is, are we really offering ourselves willingly to the Lord? Isn't it? It's that faith being exercised and being able to be a part of His plan as He set it up in families and in churches. Of course, in our obedience to Him. Are you willingly offering yourselves to the Lord? This is a good opportunity to do that. We're going to sing an invitation song, and I think it's Who Will Follow Jesus or something like that. Same page. What is it? Stand up, stand up. Okay, it's kind of the, will we show up and stand up for Jesus? Let's do that. If you need to come forward and do something a public way, do that as we stand and sing.